Right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this session, which is about establishing independence and addressing some of the problems that new investigators, new postdocs face when they're trying to establish their independence. I'm Christy Dayton. I'm professor of nursing at the University of Cambridge. I have a joint post with Cambridge University Hospitals, and that's really about trying to build research capacity and capability among more than non-medical, but I do get involved with my medical colleagues as well. And I'm joined by two colleagues from UCL, and I'll ask Manish and Nicholas to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Christine. My name is Manny Chand. I am Associate Professor of Surgery at University College London, and I am an honorary consultant colorectal surgeon at University College London Hospital, specializing predominantly in robotic surgery. My research is surgical technology, and with that I work in the Wellcome Trust ESPRC Center with engineers and computer scientists to develop various first-in-man products. So thank you very much. Delighted to be here this morning.
Thanks, Christy and Manish. My name's Nick Hamilton. I'm an ENT surgeon at UCH and also a clinical lecturer at UCL, also working in the division of surgery. My research interests really center around the delivery of cell, essentially using collagen matrices in surgical fields. And I've been an NIHR clinical lecturer following an MRC-sponsored PhD, and then, as I mentioned in the lecture I just gave, I completed a Development and Skills Enhancement Award, and I'm now very much in that mid-career phase where I'm looking for the next opportunities to take me onto the next level.
All right, great. Well, I'd like to invite anybody in the audience to please post questions. I see there's an announcement about people joining us, so it may be that people are going to be joining in a few minutes. If you have a question, please either post it in the chat, or you can choose to kind of activate and appear live and talk to us face to face. So we're very happy to have you interact in any way that you would like to. And I wanted to pick up on some things that while we're waiting for questions that Nicholas said. You had a DSE, a Development Skills Enhancement Award, which are open to those in the NIHR Academy. And just how did you think that really worked to get you to the place where you are now? How helpful was that?
Yeah, so I think it's actually a really excellent award. I mean, it has quite a broad remit, and you can kind of tailor it to whatever your individual needs are. And I think it's just a reflection of the way that perhaps we come to an end of a program of research, and it's not necessarily obvious that program of research is what we're going to continue with. And what it enabled me to do was to spend some time in the UCL clinical trials unit. And my interest is the translation of advanced therapeutic medicinal products. And I got to spend some time within the unit and understand the challenges and the process of that in essentially pilot studies. And likewise, I managed to build in an industry collaboration where I actually got to spend some time with an industry in a cell manufacturer company. And you know, that really, really inspired me that, up to then I very much worked in a laboratory environment, and I was certainly building something that was aiming to go into the clinical environment, but understanding that space between it is really important. And it gave me that insight. And in many ways it did inspire me that I want to work more towards that end of things rather than more towards the laboratory basic science end of things. And that's really where I'm hoping to position myself moving forward.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it in a way, it takes you out of that challenge of having to deliver a study. And it's really about your training and development and being able to spend time with the CTU or others. As you said, I have a doctoral student, a physio, who's doing one of the DSEs now. And after some postdoc funding, he decided before he puts in the next grant, he really needed to get the skills and the development that he needed. So this was a perfect award for him. Yeah. And Manish, have you, what about your funding and how you moved forward to get to where you are now?
Thank you. Well, I think my route to academia was slightly less orthodox, and perhaps more in line with what senior colleagues of ours would have done previously. So I've been a full-time clinical trainee throughout, and I took a period of out-of-program research for 3 years, which started off very much as a means to an end with a MD type degree. And actually I began to really enjoy learning those new skills, which I learned during those first 2 years, and then transitioned up to PhD. And then as I got to the end of my formal clinical training, I realized that actually the kind of things that sort of get me excited when I wake up in the morning about work are the academic challenges as well as the clinical challenges. And I then went round really a number of institutions, almost pitching myself and the ideas that I had, to see whether there was an opportunity to have this hybrid job whereby I'm employed by the university and the hospital then charges back for my clinical time. So I have a 50-50 split, 5 PAs for the university and 5 programmed activities for the hospital, which does provide some degree of autonomy. So that's one of the benefits. But on the flip side, you talk about funding. I think it is a bit more difficult to navigate and negotiate some of those tracks towards funding, resources, nursing support, fellows, and perhaps some of my colleagues and perhaps Nick would be able to answer this as well, that if you've got a more formalized route to academia, perhaps you understand the landscape a bit better. But there's a bit of trial and error that goes on when you're just transitioning, really, because I started off as an NHS consultant and then moved into being an academic clinician. So I'd actually worked full time as a NHS consultant for a couple of years before becoming a clinical academic. So it's a slightly different way, but I think both routes are important, and both routes certainly have their pros and cons.
And I mean, what you say is very true, Manish. What I tried to convey, that it's very much a personal choice about what you want and how you want to organize it. It's very much under the individual. How do you feel about the 50-50 split, being a busy colorectal surgeon and the demands that you have with that? I mean, how does that split work for you? Because, you know, there's various ways you can split your time, and it's very much funder dependent. And it'd just be helpful to get your opinion.
Sure. I think in the case of UCL and UCLH, there is a great deal of flexibility, and the job plans on both sides can be tailored to maximize your output for both sides, really. But it does take time to do that. So for the first perhaps 2 or 3 years, I was running around trying to do half a day here, half a day there. And what I found was that I wasn't particularly productive on either side. I had my foot in both camps, and I really wanted to be accepted in both camps, as it were. But I really struggled with keeping on top of everything. So what I did more recently is I simply have the first half of the week in academia, which up until this afternoon. And then from this afternoon onwards, it's just clinical work. And I've tried really hard not to mix the two. So I don't really manage anything clinically for the first half of the week. Don't answer emails unless they're obviously life or death issues, but certainly don't get involved in the clinical work until I'm supposed to be doing the clinical work, and vice versa. But it allows me to fully concentrate in those 2.5 days on whether it be academia or whether it be clinical work. And I think it's getting understanding how it works for you when you do have autonomy to do
and
this.
It's interesting you say that. And that was certainly my experience as a trainee, that doing half days in academia is very difficult. And you really need that full day to really get into something, and ideally 2 days, especially if you're working in a laboratory where you have time points and all the other challenges that come with that. So yeah, I certainly agree that
I think as well, if you have, it all depends as well on the type of research and type of academia you're involved in. I think if you've got other departments relying on you, such as pathology, or you're in a lab and there are other people in that lab, then I think then it is beholden on you to have formal time available to do that. Whereas if your research is a bit more flexible, then it does allow you to mix and match a little bit. But ultimately, I think you need to find what works for yourself. And it does take a few years of getting it wrong before you get it right.
I think those are important points that, first of all, you have to learn the skills of how you compartmentalize when you do have the time, as you were saying, Manish, that you don't think about the clinical work when you've got your research time. And I think a lot of these posts, particularly the NIHR clinical lecturers, they can be taken in blocks of time rather than, say, every week you've got so much research time and so much clinical time. I do find it somewhat challenging with my clinical lecturer medical colleagues who oftentimes have to take call during their research time, and that does make it challenging. So there's some clear ways, I think, medically. Now, in the east of England, we are working with AGE to fund sort of a similar clinical lectureship for non-medical staff, so that there's the same kind of opportunity to be 50% clinical, 50% research with some of the using AGE funding, again, to kind of mimic what happens with the NIHR clinical lectureships. But I think the message is that there's no one way to get to where you want to go, but it is about being open to those opportunities and finding your own way forward. And
well, the only other thing I would add about the clinical side of things, I think it becomes a little bit more straightforward if you find a clinical niche. I think if you're trying to compete with your clinical colleagues, who are, and the name of the game is volume, then I think you will struggle, because often one's research is dependent on their clinical skills, clinical ability, and clinical knowledge. And with that, to be recognized as an expert clinician in your field can become difficult if you're in a volume-based specialty. So if perhaps you, within your specialty, find a niche, I think that probably works in your favor. So in my case, I do robotic and a particular type of cancer. That means that there will going to be very few surgeons in the country that will have a higher volume based on the clinical work that I do. But if I was a bit more of a generalist, let's say, then certainly there would be surgeons around the country that would have a higher volume practice, and by definition, would be considered to be perhaps more proficient in those particular techniques.
well, you still have to meet all the requirements, because oftentimes you're doing this as in your specialty training years 5, 6, and you still have to meet all the requirements to have enough procedures, as you're saying, to have the volume or to get signed off on particular skills and things like that. So how difficult is that?
I mean, talking from personal experience, having gone through that training program, I don't think it was too difficult. The numbers that were set were not sort of particularly burdensome to achieve. I think it's just being aware of where you want to go and what you want to become, and not trying to do everything. So within ENT, I mean, it's ears, nose, and throat. Okay, I'm a throat person. So did I spend a lot of time focusing on complex ear surgery when I knew that was not going to be the pathway I would end up at as a consultant? I didn't. And that's how I maybe freed up a bit of time to accommodate my research interests, become very proficient at throat surgery, and have the research interest, but not trying to do everything, and ended up with nothing.
Okay. And where do you think the NIHR Advanced Fellowships will fit into this, or other fellowships? I suppose there's certainly other charities that might fund some of the work that both of you do.
I think it seems to me the early advanced fellowship mirrors the clinical lectureship in many respects, and then the later advanced fellowship is quite unique. Well, it's similar to the clinician scientist awards of old, and it really bridges the sort of mid postdoc period to the research professorship period. So yeah, they're really interesting and certainly fantastic opportunities. And the split of having been able to practice 40% of your working week as a clinician, I think is helpful if you're a surgeon. I think if you're just doing 2 clinical sessions a week, which is stipulated with the other funders, I think that becomes difficult to become the surgeon that a lot of us want to become. But again, it's a personal choice.
Okay, yeah. Well, I like the way that they've changed the advanced fellowship, so you can have their kind of together, but they do look at your years past PhD and kind of where you are in your career, whether you're early independence or mid-career or later moving to those chair or professorial positions. I think that flexibility with NIHR has been really helpful to people's careers, and the flexibility, as you say, around being able to maintain your clinical practice and your clinical expertise.
I think I need to present 3 action points from today's roundtable a little bit later on in the day. So rather than fumble through them myself, I'm wondering if we could maybe have a think and come up with 3 points that we can recommend as ways forward and good ideas for the future.
Okay, and I don't think we have anyone posting questions or any comments, so I guess it's for us to do. Well, I would say certainly that there's no one pathway, but to look for all of the opportunities that are available and what fits best for you for both your training as a clinician and as a researcher.
Yeah, so an individualized approach.
Yes. So, hello,
Chris.
Hi
there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Yeah, I just thought I'd just chirp in and before you start making those points, I've got some questions. How long have we got, do you know?
It will actually last until 12:10. And Nicholas, I'm going to have to leave at 12 for another commitment, so I'll hand it over to you at that time. But
sure.
All right.
So go ahead.
That's great. Well, I've got 17 minutes of questions, so I'll get going if that's all right. So, yeah, I'm Chris. I'm a trauma registrar. Just finished my PhD, and I'll be doing that. I do pragmatic clinical trials in orthopedics. So, yeah, I think as far as I can tell, I think there are 3 ways to be an academic consultant. One is to be funded by the NIHR or MRC fully. The other is to be funded by a university as an associate professor, and then you go and find you apply for sort of your own grants or for projects. And the third is to sort of do a clinical job and then sort of attract PAs by saying, I've got this grant, or I'm going to teach on this course, or I'm going to supervise this many students. Other than those 3 options, do you think there are other options that are out there? And yeah, I just wonder if you can clarify what one of those 3 you think you're in at the moment.
So, I mean, I can start. So, I guess in terms of what I'm in, I mean, I followed the sort of the clinical academic pathway through funders. I'm in a position now where I'm looking for the next funding opportunity. Now, whether I'm successful or not will dictate the answer to your question. If I'm successful, then hopefully I continue along that set pathway. If I'm not, then there are opportunities to still contribute academically within the university and the hospital without necessarily having one of these fellowships behind you. And it's interesting the role of industry as well, and introducing devices and getting buy-in from industry collaborators. There's certainly a lot of funding available in that space that you can use to maybe fund your time or fund your research program, and you don't have to have one of these fellowships. And like I alluded to before, for some people, having these fellowships is not necessarily right for them because they want to be more clinically focused than academic focused.
No, thanks. And Manish, I think I couldn't quite work out if you're in the 1 or the 2. Maybe the 2, I think.
So I'm in 2. I'm in 2. And no, I'd echo Nicholas's comments, particularly those around industry. My research is very much technology based, which is often difficult to find funding from the more traditional routes that one would go down. But there is a lot of soft funding from industry, and that does help. Often the challenge with that is the ownership of intellectual property that can often come from these type of studies. But I think there is that untapped resource of industry money that can get you by in your early years as you're generating data, generating your name as a academic in that particular field, and then that allows you to then use those early studies as part of a more formal grant process to keep the university happy. What I would say is being in that position has traditionally been one which is, I suppose, a bit of a dangerous path, because you do need to keep finding funding for yourself. The good news is that often, from what I've seen from my senior colleagues, you get rather good at this. It's like writing papers. When you first start writing papers, you think, wow, I just want to get anything published. Anything will do in any old journal. And then after a while, you get the knack of writing papers. And you realize that actually that there is a way of doing this in a certain format. And that helps. Of course, the content needs to be important too. But I think as you go along, you get more experienced in applying and finding the appropriate pots of money. But that, I think, is one of the disadvantages of being in that category 2 that you mentioned, Chris.
That's great. That's all good to know. Yeah. And so I had another broader question, which is perhaps better for a different room. But what I'm trying to work out, what I've been working out for last year and today is, why do we need all these entrepreneurs and companies with shareholders and whatnot to be taking innovation forward when we've got the NHS and NIHR? And I'm just trying to see how I'm going to progress in the future. Is it going to be, designing medtech through, individual companies, and whether those companies are then getting bought out by the NIHR or the NHS, if that's even a thing, or whether we just say, look, why don't we just you do a giant grant application, and rather than having a data scientist and a XYZ working in a company, you have them working on a grant as part of the NIHR. So I just wonder if you guys or anyone else has found that that dilemma, and in companies versus what you could just do in the NIHR as a unit. Have any of you come across that? What I'm getting at there?
Well, I was going to say the NIHR does welcome companies being part of a fellowship application. So if they provide part of the funding, I mean, that's certainly something that's open to you applying for a fellowship or a grant. And then you have to work with your governance, and oftentimes they're entrepreneurial organizations to work out the IP and all of the other issues around that, and who owns rights to what. But it is certainly doable, and I think the NHS is open to working with industry, particularly when there's joint funding available.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to what type of research you're doing. I mean, if you're doing very much basic science research, there's not as much monetary value attached to the outputs from that. Obviously, there's a huge amount of scientific value. And therefore, industry collaborators are less potentially interested in funding something like that, because ultimately they're a business. Whereas when you're looking at devices where you can create a business model surrounding it, that maybe would lean you more towards an industry type of funder. But there is a common ground in the middle, which Christy alluded to, where there's a new grant scheme called the I4I grant scheme run by the NIHR. And what they do is very much fund devices, and they kind of do act like angel investors in many respects, or VCs, but it's under the NIHR banner. So I think to me, it really depends on the project.
No, I agree with that, Nick. I think I4I and that there are various European Horizon type grants as well that are similar. But as you say, they are more directed at what would be technology-based studies. Interestingly, I'd go further on to say that it's almost that the med tech study or the med device study is probably now something which is we're beginning to see the end of, and it's all about software now. So it's about using the NHS to develop software and using the data to do that, which is, of course, precious commodity at the moment. So that kind of research, I think, is very difficult to be done within the NHS. And certainly there are some schemes within the NIHR, but you do need some degree of industry support. And often the industry support comes from startups rather than established companies. So you're not going to get a Johnson & Johnson necessarily unless they want to look at post-marketing of a particular device. They're not going to be interested in developing a next generation bit of kit with you, because they've got teams to do that already and established as part of their commercial entity. But what you do find is that often there are startups that want to work within the NHS structure. And then you can use I4I and various other schemes like this to do that. And there often is a formalized process for dividing up any particular IP. I mean, certainly there's a 40-30-30 split at UCL, as I'm sure you're aware, Nick, and UCL business or UCL partners will help aid that situation. But I do think we do need industry partners, and it cannot be just done within the NHS / NIHR.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I'll sort of take that pipe dream off the agenda. So that's good to know. So Joe, remind me, what was that 30-40-40 split again? Who were the parts of that split?
So often that's institution, PI, and then the company that you're working with.
That was that two. Was that the what was the third one? Do you remember?
Sorry, so industry partner, the PI, and then also the
PI is
institution.
As the institution lead clinical researcher.
Yeah, so whoever's idea.
Well, again,
was.
I'm not necessarily interested in being a PI and just making money on one particular device. So can you just cut yourself out of that and then just have you're an NIHR advanced lecturer or and then you just have two. So is that
interesting? You might decide to do that, but I can assure you that your colleagues won't, because these discussions take place right at the very beginning, particularly with IP, where you can inadvertently give it away by just presenting an abstract or going to a meeting. But if you're working with a team of engineers and a team of computer scientists, those conversations are very robust at the beginning of these type of projects. And also the partner arm or the business arm of the university won't get involved unless you've got a pretty good idea. So there is a formalized system in place to do this, because UCL business may end up putting in, a couple of £100,000 to try and get this CE marked, for example. And they want to see some return on that. So you yourself may decide to give it away, but there will be members of your team that perhaps won't.
Okay, of the team, yeah, because I can see if you were an NIHR, if you're employed by the NIHR and getting paid by the NIHR, I don't know if that means that that you're waiving your intellectual property and giving it to the NIHR because they're paying your salary. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just curious. I haven't sort of thought about these things and how that's going to work. So, and do you have any experience of that, either of you, about whether you is that a thing about if you're being employed by a university, you don't have intellectual property, or is it variable?
I think it depends where the intellectual property comes from. If the intellectual property arises from your university work, then certainly the university has a share of that. There are some people do work outside of university time or hours, or maybe they have a split and they may pursue inventions in their own personal time effectively, and grow a project from there, because of some of these IP issues. But there are lots of different ways around doing it. And in some respects, the points you're raising are really important and not very well defined, are they? There's no website where it lays it all out for you, and perhaps that can be a recommendation that we move forward with.
Okay, yeah. So you've got your 3 points then, haven't we? So we've got that can be one point. We want, yeah, PR, intellectual property clarity. And then I guess point 2 is that there can be 3 different, there are different ways of tackling being a consultant, an academic consultant. And was there a third point?
I think
we're back to the table. Yeah. Well, I think
we've got
2
4 minutes.
We've got 4 minutes. Yeah. Well, I suppose, and then I guess you could just talk about, we've also discussed about industry collaboration. So, which I think is possibly a separate point to, intellectual property as part of your job plan and your contract, and which is a separate point to the need to work with industry collaborators. And again, that's sort of educating for me to sort of let go of this idea that I can just tweet to NHS Digital and they'll create this giant data gathering survey for me. So that's all good. Yeah, thanks very much for your time today. And those are all some good learning points for me.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Great. Yeah, I'll head over to the main room then. I'll see you back there.
Okay,
thanks again.
Great. Do we have if there are any questions from the rest of the attendees? I think you can put them in the chat box, and we're obviously happy to ask them in the final few minutes. Is there anything else you wanted to cover, Manish?
No, I'm fine. I think that was a good discussion.
Okay, well, I don't see a flurry of points coming through on the chat box. So if that's the case, maybe we'll leave it there, and we will return to the main stage.
Excellent. Thank you very much.